Losing my parents was like stepping off a cliff and falling into a void. One day, we were a family, a tight little unit of love, arguments, and Sunday dinners. The next, it was just me, alone in a world that suddenly felt enormous and unkind. My sisters, Clara and Mia, were supposed to be my safety net, but instead, they became ghosts. They were older than me, already adults when our parents died, and for reasons I couldn't understand then, they decided they couldn't handle me. Maybe I reminded them too much of everything we'd lost. Maybe they were just selfish. Either way, one day I was with them, and the next, I was in foster care. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I kept telling myself they'd come back for me. I'd sit by the window in every new foster home, imagining them pulling up in some old car, their faces guilty but happy to see me. That hope burned bright and sharp for the first few months, but as the weeks turned into years, it dimmed. By the time I turned 12, it was gone entirely, leaving behind a dull ache I carried everywhere. The foster system was exactly as bad as people say. I bounced between homes, some better than others, but none of them ever feeling like mine. A few foster parents tried, I'll give them that, but I'd already learned not to trust anyone. People leave. That's what they do. If you don't rely on them, they can't disappoint you. By the time I aged out at 18, I was as emotionally guarded as a locked safe. I scraped together a life for myself, got a job, found a tiny apartment, and kept my head down. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was enough. Or at least, it was until Emily came along. She worked at the cafe where I stopped every morning for coffee before work. At first, she was just a smiling face behind the counter, someone who remembered my order and made small talk. But over time, she became more. She had this way of looking at me, like she could see straight through all the walls I'd built. Emily was everything I wasn't, optimistic, open, and full of light. It didn't make sense, but somehow we fit. She made me feel like maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. We'd been together for a year when she decided to do something that, in her words, would change everything for the better. She went looking for my sisters. I didn't know until it was too late. Emily sat me down one evening, her face lit with excitement. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling with anticipation. "I found them, Clara and Mia. They want to see you." My chest tightened like a fist had clenched around my heart. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All the old feelings I'd buried, the hurt, the anger, the betrayal, they came rushing back like a tidal wave. I wanted to yell at her, to make her understand what she'd done, but the words wouldn't come. Emily, oblivious to my turmoil, kept talking. She told me how Clara was a teacher now, how Mia had a son. "They've missed you," she said, her eyes sparkling. "They're sorry for everything." I didn't believe her. How could I? These were the same people who had abandoned me. But curiosity is a cruel thing. Despite my better judgment, I agreed to meet them. The cafe where we arranged to meet felt too bright, too exposed. I sat at a corner table, my coffee untouched, my stomach churning. When they walked in, I almost didn't recognize them. Clara looked older than her years, her hair streaked with gray, her shoulders hunched like she was carrying the weight of the world. Mia was thinner than I remembered, her face drawn and tired, though she still had that defiant spark in her eyes. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Clara broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Jake," she said, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "It's so good to see you." I wanted to say something sharp, something to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused me. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded and let them talk. They told me about their lives, about the struggles they'd faced since we last saw each other. Clara had gone through a bitter divorce. Mia was raising a child on her own, and both of them seemed weighed down by regrets. They apologized over and over, saying they'd been young and overwhelmed, that they hadn't known how to handle losing our parents. Their words stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. A crack in the armor I'd spent so long building. They started showing up in my life more and more after that. Clara would call me almost every day. Sometimes just to chat, sometimes to apologize all over again. Mia came by my apartment one evening with her son, a shy 6-year-old named Alex. He reminded me so much of myself at that age, wide-eyed and unsure of the world. Emily, of course, was over the moon. She thought this was a happy ending I deserved, the family I'd always wanted. But it wasn't that simple. It was never that simple. Clara and Mia were back in my life, but it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt more like opening a door to a room I'd locked away, only to find it full of things I didn't want to face. They called often, texted even more, acting as though we were trying to make up for lost time. Emily kept encouraging me to respond, saying this was the kind of connection that could heal the past. But every time I picked up the phone or sat across from them, all I could think about was how they'd left me behind when I needed them most. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Clara would ask how I was doing, share stories about her students, and mention small things about her life. Mia, always more direct, brought Alex along whenever she could, as if he were a buffer between us. I couldn't deny he was a great kid, quiet but curious, with this way of looking at me that made it hard to stay angry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their sudden interest in me than guilt or love. Then came the favors. Clara called one evening, her voice trembling as she explained she was struggling to pay off some loans. She didn't outright ask for money, but the implication was there. Mia, on the other hand, was up front. She needed help finding a lawyer to fight for custody of Alex. Her ex had dragged her into court, claiming she was an unfit mother. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't rich, and I wasn't a lawyer, but that wasn't the point. The point was that after years of silence, they didn't just want me back in their lives. They wanted something from me. Emily thought I was being unfair. "Jake, they're trying," she said, her eyes pleading. "They're family. They made mistakes, but people change." I wanted to believe her. I really did, but the timing of it all gnawed at me. Why now? Why, after all these years, did they suddenly want to reconnect? It didn't feel like love. It felt like desperation. I decided to test them. The next time Clara called, I told her I'd think about helping but needed some space to process everything. Her response was immediate. "Of course, Jake," she said, her voice tight. "Take all the time you need." But something about the way she said it felt off, like she was afraid I might cut them off entirely. Mia, on the other hand, didn't take it so well. "I don't get it," she said when I told her the same thing. "We're trying to make things right, and you're acting like we're the enemy." Her words stung, but I held my ground. It wasn't just about the money or the favors. It was about trust. How could I trust people who had already abandoned me once? How could I be sure they wouldn't do it again once they got what they wanted? A few weeks later, Clara showed up unannounced at my apartment. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and puffy like she'd been crying. "Jake, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "Mia and we've been struggling for a long time. When Mom and Dad died, we didn't know what to do. We were barely holding it together ourselves. Leaving you, it wasn't because we didn't love you. We just didn't know how to take care of you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much pain she caused, but all I could do was sit there, staring at her as she poured out her heart. She told me about the arguments she and Mia had after our parents died, how they'd blamed each other for not stepping up, how guilt had eaten away at them over the years. "We thought about coming back for you," she said, her voice breaking. "But by then, we thought it was too late. We didn't think you'd forgive us." It wasn't an excuse, but it was the closest thing to an explanation I'd ever gotten. For the first time, I saw her not as the sister who had abandoned me, but as a flawed, broken person who had made a terrible mistake. It didn't erase the past, but it made it harder to hold on to my anger. Then Mia called. She didn't apologize or explain. Instead, she asked me to meet her at the park. When I got there, she was sitting on a bench, Alex playing on the swings nearby. "I know Clara probably told you everything," she said, not looking at me. "And I know I've been pushy, but you're my brother, Jake, and I need you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, I saw just how scared she was. "I don't know if I can be what you need," I admitted. "I don't even know if I can forgive you." She nodded, her eyes glassy. "I get that, but I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove that we're not the same people we were back then." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken pain. I didn't know if I believed her, but part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to believe that people could change, that maybe, just maybe, we could be a family again. That night, I told Emily everything about Clara's confession, Mia's plea, and my own confusion. She listened quietly, her face unreadable. When I was done, she took my hand and said, "Jake, you don't have to make a decision right now. But whatever you choose, make sure it's what you want, not what you think they or I want." Her words stayed with me. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice. A week after that conversation with Emily, Clara invited me over for dinner. She said it would be just the three of us, her, Mia, and me. No kids, no distractions. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see if they were serious about rebuilding our relationship, or if it was just another way to ask for something. Their apartment felt oddly familiar. There were old photos on the walls, some of them of me as a kid, and a few knickknacks that must have belonged to our parents. It hit me then how much of our family's history they had kept while I had nothing but faded memories. Clara cooked spaghetti, the one thing she'd known how to make back when we were kids, and the smell brought back a rush of nostalgia I wasn't prepared for. Dinner started awkwardly. We talked about safe topics, the weather, Alex's school, Clara's job. But then Clara set down her fork and looked at me, her face serious. "Jake, there's something you need to know," she said, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. Mia stiffened, glancing at Clara as if she wanted to stop her. "Are you sure this is the right time?" Mia asked, her tone cautious. Clara nodded. "He deserves to know." My heart started racing. "Know what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Clara took a deep breath. "The reason we didn't come back for you, it wasn't just because we were scared or overwhelmed. There was more to it." She paused, her eyes glistening with tears. "When Mom and Dad died, they left behind a lot of debt. It was bad. Creditors came after us, and we couldn't keep the house. Everything fell apart so fast. We didn't just lose them, we lost everything. And then someone threatened us." "Threatened you?" The words felt heavy, impossible. Mia finally spoke up, her voice low and strained. "Dad owed money to the wrong people. After the funeral, a man showed up at the house. He said we needed to pay what Dad owed, or he'd make us pay in other ways. We didn't know what to do." Clara thought. "She thought you'd be safer if we left you with the system." My chest tightened. "You're saying you left me to protect me?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice cracking. "It was the hardest thing we ever did, Jake, and it broke us. But we thought it was the only way to keep you safe." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The anger I'd carried for so long collided with a wave of confusion and disbelief. Could it be true? Had they abandoned me out of fear, not selfishness? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I demanded. "Why wait until now?" Mia's jaw clenched. "Because we didn't think you'd believe us. And maybe we didn't want to face it ourselves. But things are different now. That man, he's back." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean he's back?" Clara leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "A few weeks ago, someone left a note on my car. It was just one word. Soon. We think it's him or someone connected to him. We're scared, Jake. And we didn't know who else to turn to." I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. So, what? You want me to save you? After everything? No, Clara said quickly. We don't want anything from you except your forgiveness. But if you can help, if there's anything you can do, she trailed off, her voice breaking. Mia didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said enough. She was scared, desperate, and maybe even ashamed. I left without saying goodbye. My mind was spinning, my emotions a tangled mess. On one hand, I wanted to believe them, to think they'd acted out of love, not indifference. On the other hand, it felt like another betrayal, another manipulation. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me. She must have seen the look on my face because she didn't ask any questions, just pulled me into a hug. Whatever it is, she whispered, you don't have to deal with it alone. Her words stayed with me through the night, as I replayed Clara and Mia's confession over and over in my head. If they were telling the truth, then everything I thought I knew about my childhood was a lie. But if they were lying, then I was walking straight into another trap. The next day, I decided to dig into it myself. I started with my father's old records, which Clara had given me during one of our earlier meetings. Most of it was mundane bank statements, utility bills, but then I found a ledger tucked into a manila folder. It was filled with names and numbers, some crossed out, some circled. One name stood out, M. Griffin. It was circled in red, with a note beside it. Final payment due. I didn't recognize the name, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I decided to do some digging online, and it didn't take long to find a connection. M. Griffin was a known loan shark, someone with a reputation for getting what he was owed by any means necessary. The pieces started falling into place, but they didn't make me feel any better. If Griffin, or someone working for him, was after my sisters, then this wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, and maybe even the future. I didn't know what to do. Confronting Griffin seemed insane, but doing nothing felt just as wrong. For years, I told myself I didn't owe my sisters anything, but now I wasn't so sure. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a message from Clara. It was a photo of the note she'd found on her car. Just one word, written in jagged, angry letters. Soon, the sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Whether I liked it or not, I was already involved. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that note. Soon, the word echoed in my head, twisting into something darker each time I thought about it. By morning, I still hadn't decided what to do. Confronting Griffin felt like walking into a lion's den, but ignoring the problem wouldn't make it go away. Emily noticed my restlessness over breakfast. You're not yourself, she said, watching me push scrambled eggs around my plate. I think I might be in over my head, I admitted. I told her everything. The ledger, the name Griffin, the threats against my sisters. She didn't interrupt, just listened with a calm that I didn't feel. When I finished, she took a deep breath. Jake, you're not a superhero. You don't have to handle this alone. Her words made sense, but they didn't change how I felt. These were my sisters, my family, no matter how complicated our history was. If I didn't step up, who would? Later that day, I called Clara. I need you to tell me everything, I said. Don't leave anything out. She hesitated for a moment, then said, come over. It's better if we talk in person. When I arrived, Clara and Mia were waiting for me in the living room. Their faces were pale, their eyes heavy with worry. It was clear they hadn't been sleeping well either. Clara handed me a cup of coffee, but I barely touched it. Griffin's been in the picture for years, Clara began, her voice shaky. When Dad first borrowed money from him, it was supposed to be a short-term loan. But the interest kept piling up, and Dad, he made some bad choices. He hid it from us at first, but after he and Mom died, we found out everything. We tried to negotiate with Griffin, but he didn't care about excuses. He wanted his money. Mia picked up where Clara left off. When we couldn't pay, he started making threats. He said he'd hurt us, or worse. That's when Clara decided to leave you in foster care. She thought it was the only way to keep you safe. I leaned back, trying to process what they were saying. And now he's back? After all these years? Clara nodded. We don't know why. Maybe he thinks we've got money now. Maybe he's just trying to scare us. But we can't handle this alone, Jake. We need your help. There it was again. Help. The word felt like a weight pressing down on me. But this time, it wasn't just about money or favors. It was about survival. Have you gone to the police? I asked. Mia scoffed. What are they going to do? Griffin's too smart to leave evidence. All we have is that note, and that's not enough for them to take us seriously. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was probably right. People like Griffin operated in the shadows, where the law couldn't reach them. That night, I sat down with the ledger again. The more I looked at it, the more I realized it wasn't just a record of debts. It was a road map. There were dates, locations, and cryptic notes that seemed to hint at Griffin's operations. If I could figure out what they meant, maybe I could get some leverage. I started making calls, reaching out to old friends who might have connections in places I didn't. One of them, a guy named Mark, used to work as a private investigator. When I explained the situation, he agreed to meet me the next day. Mark was older now, with gray hair and a slight limp, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He took one look at the ledger and let out a low whistle. You weren't kidding, he said. This guy's got his fingers in a lot of pies. Gambling, loan sharking, maybe even drugs. Can you help me? I asked. Mark nodded slowly. I'll see what I can find. But you should be careful, Jake. People like Griffin don't play by the rules. Over the next few days, Mark kept me updated. He uncovered a few addresses linked to Griffin's name, including a warehouse on the edge of town that seemed to be his base of operations. If he's making threats, chances are he's doing it from there, Mark said. The thought of confronting Griffin made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore it. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting Clara and Mia. Emily wasn't thrilled when I told her what I planned to do. You're walking into a dangerous situation, she said, her voice tight with worry. I don't have a choice, I replied. If I don't do this, they'll never be safe. The warehouse was exactly what I expected. Run down, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Mark had warned me not to go alone, but I didn't want to risk dragging anyone else into this. Inside, the air was damp and smelled like rust. I followed the sound of voices to a small office in the back. Griffin was there, sitting behind a desk, flanked by two men who looked like they belonged in a mob movie. Jake, right? Griffin said, leaning back in his chair. He looked nothing like I'd imagined, short, balding, with a wiry frame, but his eyes were cold and calculating. I want you to leave my family alone, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Griffin chuckled. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what you're up to, I said, holding up my phone. I recorded the entire conversation on a hidden app. Griffin's smile faded. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But you're playing a dangerous game. I'm not playing, I said, meeting his gaze. Stay away from my sisters, or you'll regret it. For a moment, I thought he might laugh again, but instead, he nodded. Fine, he said. You've made your point. But if you cross me again, you won't get another warning. I left the warehouse, feeling a mix of relief and dread. I'd bought us some time, but I knew this wasn't over. People like Griffin didn't back down easily. When I told Clara and Mia what had happened, they were both shocked and grateful. We'll never be able to thank you enough, Clara said, her eyes brimming with tears. But I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because, despite everything, they were my family. And family, no matter how broken, is worth fighting for. For a few weeks after the confrontation with Griffin, life seemed to settle. Clara and Mia stopped receiving threats. The note on Clara's car felt like a distant memory, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Griffin had decided to leave us alone. But deep down, I knew better. Men like him didn't just walk away. They waited, watched, and struck when you least expected it. I tried to get back to normal. Emily and I talked about moving forward, maybe even getting a place together. For the first time in years, I started thinking about the future instead of being stuck in the past. Then, one evening, Clara called. Her voice was shaking, and I could hear Alex crying in the background. "He's back, Jake," she said, her words barely audible. My heart sank. What happened? Someone broke into the apartment. Nothing was stolen, but everything was trashed. There was a note on the kitchen table. What did it say? I asked, already dreading the answer. Last chance. I clenched my fists, anger surging through me. Griffin wasn't just trying to scare us anymore. He was making it clear that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Emily didn't hesitate when I told her what had happened. "We'll figure this out together," she said firmly. Her support gave me strength, but I knew this was something I had to face head-on. I called Mark, the private investigator, and told him what was happening. He didn't sound surprised. "I warned you this might happen," he said. "Griffin's the kind of guy who doesn't like loose ends." "Then we need to tie them up," I said. "What else do you have on him?" Mark hesitated. "There's one thing. It's risky, but it might work. Griffin's got a rival, someone who's been trying to take over his operations for years. If we can get them to turn on each other." The idea was dangerous, but it was the only option we had. Mark gave me a name, Victor Rains. He was another lone shark, just as ruthless as Griffin, but with one key difference. He hated Griffin with a passion. Reaching out to Victor felt like making a deal with the devil, but I was running out of options. Through Mark, I managed to set up a meeting in a neutral location, a dingy diner on the outskirts of town. Victor was nothing like Griffin. He was younger, with a sharp suit and an air of calculated confidence. "So, you're the guy stirring up trouble for Griffin," he said, smirking as he sipped his coffee. "I wouldn't call it stirring up trouble," I said. "I just want him out of my life." Victor leaned back, his expression amused. "And you think I can help with that? You want to take him down, don't you?" I asked. "I've got information that could give you an edge." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll bite. What have you got?" I handed him a copy of the ledger, the one I'd taken from my father's things. "This ties Griffin to illegal operations across the city. It's enough to get his entire network shut down, or to take it over, if that's what you're after." Victor's eyes lit up as he flipped through the pages. "You've been busy," he said, clearly impressed. "All right, Jake. You've got a deal." I walked out of that diner, feeling a mix of relief and dread. I just put my faith in another criminal. But if it meant keeping my family safe, it was worth the risk. The next week was quiet, too quiet. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Griffin to retaliate or for Victor to double-cross me. But nothing happened. Then one evening, Clara called again. This time, her voice was calm. "It's over, Jake," she said. "What do you mean?" Victor paid Griffin a visit. I don't know what they talked about, but Griffin packed up and left town. He's gone. I didn't know whether to believe her. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, it became clear that she was right. Griffin was gone. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Clara and Mia began rebuilding their lives, free from the shadow of fear that had haunted them for so long. As for me, I finally let go of the anger I'd carried all these years. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but I realized that holding on to the past was only hurting me. Emily and I took a trip to the coast not long after. Standing on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time, I was ready to live it.